Hi, Stephanie. I am thrilled to have you as a guest on the Best of Women's Fiction podcast because, to quote your bio, you write historical fiction for women about women.
I'm glad to be here. And yes, I do. And I love it.
I love asking authors how they become authors. Their journeys are often as varied as the stories they write. So tell me a bit about your journey to becoming a historical fiction author. Was it a direct path or more meandering?
It was remarkably direct once I decided that's what I wanted to do. The surprising thing to me was actually deciding it because I really never thought about writing historical fiction. I've always been a reader and I've always had, an interest in history. But when I stayed home with my kids. I had 4 kids. And when my youngest one went into school, my oldest daughter asked me what I was going to do now that I was, had all this time on my hands, which you never have time on your hands. But anyway, I said, I don't know. And she said, well, what would you do if you could do anything? And I said, oh, I'd write historical fiction. Like if we're talking anything. And she said, why aren't you doing that? I'm like, well, it sounds hard. I don't know how to start. I've never done anything like this before. I'm probably not any good at it, all of those things. And she said, Mom, you would never let us get away with those kind of excuses. I'm like, you're right.
He's so wise.
So that was kind of the start when I really started thinking about it. And it was hard. And I didn't know what I was doing. And I wasn't any good at it at the beginning. And so it was all of those things. But, years later and work and, really, giving it my best shot like I would expect my kids to. And lo and behold, my 5th novel.
Drawing from your personal experience and the journey that led you to where you are now, what one piece of advice do you think is most important for writers?
I think find the story that you really love. Maybe not something that you think will sell or that you think is popular at the time, but something you really want to write about because you're going to live in that world for a really long time. And it's going to be with you your whole life, really, once you create that story. So make sure it's something that you really want to do, like a time period or a story or a character that you can stay with for a long time. I guess that would be it.
So speaking of stories we love, of course, the reason we're here today is to talk about your latest novel, Codename Edelweiss. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
You can pronounce it Edelweiss or Edelweiss would be the German way, right?
Would you start by telling our listeners what it is about?
It is based on a true story that happened in 1933 Los Angeles about a lone Jewish lawyer who, with his band of amateur spies, discovered and foiled Hitler's plot to take over Hollywood. Which sounds crazy, but it's one of those things that is where truth is stranger than fiction. It is based on an actual true story and events and people.
I was fascinated to hear that this was based on a true story. Do you remember the first time you heard this story, which, if I read correctly, was relatively unknown until recently?
Yeah, it really is an unknown piece of our history in the 1930s. And that's because a lot of the records were, I believe, kept by the FBI and just released maybe 10 years ago. But yeah, I do remember very clearly when I was researching my previous book, which is called In a Far Off Land, and it's set in 1930s Los Angeles also. So sometimes you go down rabbit holes or this and that. Well, I was looking at books and I saw this book called Hitler in Los Angeles by Stephen Ross. And I thought, wait a minute, Hitler never went to Los Angeles, that I know of. And so I started reading it. And as I read about this Jewish lawyer who really was prophetic in what he saw happening in Germany and what he found happening in Los Angeles in 1933, like very early on when Hitler was barely known to us. And I thought, is this true? Could this really be true? And I did a little research and I was like, yes. And I said, this is what I want to write about next time. That makes a great book. And I ran it by my husband. He was like, oh, yeah. And so, yeah, it was just perfect. I couldn't wait to finish up with In a Far Off Land and get started. And I knew the title right away. what I wanted to call it. So
And
yeah.
how did the title come about?
The title, well, I love everything German because I mean that's one thing that does draw me to this book is because I speak German. I've been in Germany a lot. I studied in Austria for, part of my school year, and I love the Edelweiss, the song, the idea of Edelweiss, like the whole Sound of Music thing. It's just this pure, very perfect flower, and we also do associate it with World War II, probably because of Sound of Music. And so I thought, yeah, that's the perfect flower to use as a code name for my spy because Leon Lewis did use code names, and so I'm like, that's gonna be it.
As our regular listeners know, my favorite part of the writing process is research. So I love hearing about how authors go about it. What was your research process like for Codename Edelweiss? Did you have any favorite sources?
Oh yeah, I mean the book by Stephen Ross was definitely the starting point, and his research is impeccable. I mean that book was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in 2017, so I mean he knew what he was doing. And I did contact him also, and got some more, you know, like research sources that he used, and of course the back of the book with his footnotes was full of great sources. But then there's a website of the California State University in Northridge has all of Leon Lewis's boxes and boxes of his records, and he kept meticulous records. So it was COVID, sadly, or I would have been in California. Um, but they're so good about helping you, and a whole lot of the records are scanned and digitally available. So you could really get those primary sources, which are just so fun. It makes you feel like you're right there when you're reading someone's handwriting. You're looking at the actual letters that anti-Semitic organizations sent out to people. You're just like, wow. So that was awesome. It was really fun to research this one.
Was there a piece of research that you wanted to include in the novel, but it didn't fit the story or had to be cut?
Hmm. I don't think there was, there was stuff I would have expanded on in the book, um, because I just found it so interesting. But the book I always run long on my novels anyway, and this one ran quite a bit over what my publisher wanted. So when I turned it in, I was afraid that they were going to get back to me and say, you need to cut, which is what they usually say to me. And this time, my editor got back to me. She goes, it's long, but I can't see anything we can cut. And I was like, oh, darn, I should have put some more in about this movie. This movie that was never made was, I don't know if you know about who Herman Mankiewicz is. He was a Jewish writer for MGM. So he wrote screenplays. He wrote Wizard of Oz, parts of Wizard of Oz, and almost all of Citizen Kane. And he wrote a movie script called Mad Dog of Europe. And it was like basically a satire of Adolf Hitler, but it was so early. It was like 1933. So nobody really knew what was going on. They're like, why is he so crazy about this guy in Germany? Like, we have too many troubles here in the US. And all of the studios rejected it. They wouldn't make the movie because they said it was too inflammatory, too anti-German, all these things. And so he never got that movie made. And it was fascinating how he saw early on what a problem Hitler was going to be. So I would have put more in there about that. But it did make its way in. It does. The finale, the final part of the book does have part of the movie in it.
For those of us who don't already have a TBR pile to last a lifetime, tell us a bit about what you're reading. What books should we not miss right now?
Ooh. Yeah, I've been reading a lot of World War II kinds, and I really need to get away from it. I know that that's really big in historical fiction right now, and I feel like I need to expand my horizons. But I just read Amanda Barrett's book called Within These Walls of Sorrow, and it's brutal as far as like emotionally, because it's about the slums in, not the slums, but the ghettos, the German ghetto or the Jewish ghettos in Krakow. And I have been to Krakow, and I was like, oh, I got to read that because I love Poland. Um, and it was really good, but it was really a tough read. So yeah. And what else am I reading? That's a good question. Oh, I just read a very fun book. I needed, like, after this, Within These Walls of Sorrow, I had to have something a little more. And I read the one. It's called Truly Remarkable Creatures or Remarkable Creatures. Do you know that one? I'm
Yeah.
not getting the title right. But it's about this woman in Washington State who makes friends with an octopus, and a giant Pacific octopus. And the octopus is named Marcellus, and he has his own, like, point of view. It's absolutely adorable and such a good book. So that was my lighter read.
I want to ask a bit about your background with Germany. You mentioned that you've been several times, that you speak German. How did that come about? How did your life lead you there?
Yeah, it's a family thing. My dad was German. He grew up speaking German. He lived in a Mennonite community in Pennsylvania, and so he spoke German. And I just always wanted to learn it, so I learned it in high school. I went to Germany even as a high schooler. That started my love of travel, which is a problem. How much I like to get out of the country. Um, but I just fell in love with Germany. I love everything about it: the cathedrals, the castles, the history, the language. I find beautiful. Many people don't. So it's always kind of in the back of my mind as one of my favorite places, and I like to research it. So that.
Well, I also want to share how people can find you. Can you tell us your website and where you like to hang out on social media?
Yeah, StephanieLandsem.com. And I do a lot of research stuff there. Like, if anybody's actually more interested in the historical side of the books and just little tidbits that I find, that's going to be on my, that's going to be on my website. And then Facebook too. I put a lot of that stuff on Facebook at Stephanie Landsem. Instagram, I do a little more fun stuff there, like my travel and my dog and my cat pictures. You know how Instagram is. So I'm also there.
Before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to talk about that we haven't covered yet?
No, other than I just am glad to be here. It's fun to talk historical fiction, and I hope everybody enjoys Codename Edelweiss as much as I enjoyed writing it and researching it.
Can you tell us what might be on the horizon for you? What you're working on now?
Yeah, I'm playing around with the idea of a new time period, the 1950s, which is, I think, really fun. And I'm looking at a story about the 1959 Hebron earthquake that not a whole lot of people know about, but it's also known as the Yellowstone earthquake. So it was an earthquake that pretty much ripped apart Yellowstone Park, and a whole lot of people died, and a whole lot of stuff went on with the tourists there. So it's a neat little unknown piece of history that I'm looking into right now.
I'll look forward to that one too.
I hope so.
Stephanie, thank you again for joining us on the podcast and sharing your book and your experience as an author with our listeners. It's been a lot of fun chatting with you.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley.